Some moments feel like they were waiting for you long before they actually happened, sitting quietly inside your chest and making your breath feel heavier than it should. My name is Brianna Hayes. I am 26 years old, and I learned very early that weekend dinners were never about comfort for me, especially when someone new was watching everything. At that weekend dinner, my sister introduced her new boyfriend with a smile that felt practiced and controlled, while I noticed how the attention in the room slowly moved toward me without anyone saying a word. The silence felt familiar, not because it was quiet, but because it was always pointed in my direction, as if I was an object they were waiting to examine. When he politely asked what I did for work, his tone sounded harmless, yet I felt my stomach tighten before I could answer. My father leaned forward just slightly, his voice calm enough to sound reasonable, yet sharp enough to cut through me. "Don't embarrass us. Just answer carefully, so nothing sounds strange in front of people who matter." My mother followed without missing a beat, her voice flat in the way it always was when she wanted to make something feel small. "This time, try to lie so you don't sound so pathetic like you usually do at family dinners." The air around me felt thicker, not because anyone moved, but because everyone was waiting for me to shrink the way I always had, before waiting for me to choose silence instead of truth. I kept my voice steady, refused to make myself smaller for their comfort. Slowly lifted my eyes and spoke the truth about this family. 15 minutes later, everything they thought they controlled quietly started to fall apart. If you think you know what happened next, stay here for the rest of the story, because the real truth was far more uncomfortable than anyone at that table was ready to face. Long before that dinner ever happened, I already knew where I stood inside that house. I learned it slowly through small pauses that lasted too long, through smiles that felt tight, through the way my presence quietly became something to manage rather than welcome. My name is rarely said out loud in moments that matter, and over time, I accepted that silence as a normal part of belonging. My father, Richard, was the first person who turned my work into a subject that needed to be handled carefully. He never shouted about it, never openly attacked it, but he always adjusted conversations when guests arrived, guiding topics away from me as if my life might embarrass the room. My mother, Linda, followed the same pattern in softer ways, changing her tone whenever my job became part of the discussion, lowering her voice, as though the walls themselves might judge. My sister Brielle never hid her opinions. She would smile politely in front of others, but her eyes always told the real story, especially in the quiet moments when only family could hear. She treated my work like something temporary, something unfinished, something that would eventually be replaced by something more acceptable. Over time, I stopped correcting her, not because I agreed, but because the effort felt heavier than the silence. Family dinners became lessons in observation instead of connection. People talked about careers, promotions, relationships, milestones, and vacations, while I learned to measure my words before they reached my mouth. Every time I tried to contribute, the air shifted enough to make me stop mid-sentence. It was not loud rejection, but it was precise enough to feel. I learned to laugh softly, nod carefully, and stay just interesting enough not to cause discomfort. I was always the first one to arrive at gatherings and the last one to leave, hoping that time and effort might earn something close to respect. Instead, I became the person who filled empty space while everyone waited for conversations that mattered more. I watched how their faces changed when someone brought up accomplishments that were not mine, and how quickly those same faces settled when I quietly stepped back. There was a moment I remember clearly, one that never involved shouting or tears, but stayed with me because of how quiet it was. Someone asked about my life, and for 1 second I thought they meant it. Before I could answer fully, the question floated away, replaced by laughter and stories that did not include me. That was the first time I understood that curiosity had conditions, and that my life only mattered when it could become entertainment. After that, control became a survival skill. I learned how to monitor every word, every reaction, and every small movement so that I would not disturb the balance of the room. I practiced shrinking myself in ways that felt invisible to others but painfully real to me, because peace in that house required me to take up as little emotional space as possible. Over time, I stopped expecting anything different. I stopped waiting for someone to ask how I was doing and mean it. I stopped hoping that my work would be seen as honest or respectable. Instead, I built a version of myself that could sit quietly, smile when required, and disappear when necessary, all so that the house could remain comfortable without my presence truly being felt. 2 days before that dinner, my chest already felt tight every time I thought about walking back into that house. I stayed in my room longer than necessary, not because I was late, but because I needed more time to decide which version of myself would be allowed to sit at that table. Every family dinner felt like an evaluation dressed up as a tradition, where my tone, my posture, and even my breathing needed to be balanced carefully to avoid becoming the problem nobody wanted to talk about directly. I stood in front of the mirror without searching for beauty, focusing instead on looking neutral enough to disappear if needed. I changed my clothes more than once, not out of vanity, but out of fear that something about me might invite questions I did not have the strength to answer honestly. A part of me kept calculating how to look normal in a way that never felt natural, as if normality was a language I had learned by listening instead of speaking. The news about Brielle bringing someone home did not feel like a surprise, but it created a quiet shift inside my chest that was harder to control. I could already feel the invisible comparisons lining up before they were spoken. I imagined the way glances would change, the way silence would last longer when my name came up, the way my presence would feel heavier, simply because someone new would be studying the room. That feeling sat in my stomach long before I reached for my jacket. For a brief moment, I considered staying behind. The thought appeared softly, almost kindly, suggesting a headache or a last-minute obligation that could save me from stepping into a room where I would have to perform calmness. I picked up my phone and stared at the screen, knowing there was no real reason to send a message, because the truth was simpler and more painful. I did not have the courage to choose myself over the expectation of showing up. As the minutes passed, the loneliness started before I even left the room. It did not feel dramatic or loud, but it wrapped around me in a steady quiet that felt heavier than noise. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to slow my breathing while my thoughts ran ahead of my body, already preparing for conversations that had not begun, already rehearsing answers I had not been asked. I touched the door handle and paused, not out of indecision, but out of recognition. I knew that once I opened that door, the version of me that existed alone would disappear, replaced by the careful version that smiled at the right moments, nodded at the right comments, and stayed silent when silence was required. That version of me was not fake, but it was tired, shaped by years of learning how to survive rooms that never felt fully safe. The hallway felt narrower than usual, as if the house itself had become aware of the weight I was carrying. Each step toward the living room made my thoughts quieter, not because I felt calm, but because I was already bracing myself for whatever version of normal I would have to become. I understood before reaching the table that this night would not be simple, even if nothing exploded, because the hardest moments were always quiet ones that nobody else seemed to notice. By the time my hand rested on the back of the chair, I had already promised myself that I would endure whatever came next, without drawing attention to the effort it would take. I was not brave enough to walk away, but I was quiet enough to stay, and sometimes that felt like the only strength I was allowed to have. The moment we sat down at that table, silence stopped feeling normal. There was nothing dramatic about the way Brielle introduced Trevor, which somehow made the tension feel heavier. Her voice stayed light, confident, controlled, in the way she always mastered when she wanted to appear perfect, and every person at the table adjusted their posture as if they were being measured by the presence of someone new. I felt the shift immediately, the invisible movement of attention tightening toward me long before anyone spoke my name. Trevor's eyes moved toward me in a natural, polite way that looked harmless to anyone who did not know this room. He smiled slightly, as if trying to make things comfortable, and asked what I did for work using a tone that felt respectful, almost careful, as though he wanted to show he was trying to understand the family he had stepped into. Before I could answer, Dad stepped in with his voice calm and smooth-sounding conversational, while carrying a weight that pressed down on me in a familiar way. Don't embarrass us, just keep your answers simple, and don't make this awkward for everyone at this table. The words sounded casual, but the warning underneath them felt sharp, as if I had already said something wrong before opening my mouth. Mom followed instantly, her tone steady and flat, carrying that quiet edge that had shaped most of my childhood, without ever raising her voice. This time, try to lie so you don't sound so pathetic in front of someone important for once. She did not look at me when she spoke. She did not need to. The message was never meant to be shared, only obeyed. A couple of short comments floated across the table, not shouted, not dramatic, just placed there to close the door before I could open it. We don't need details. Just say something normal and move on. Each word felt rehearsed, as if they had practiced these moments so many times that it no longer required effort. I lowered my eyes for a brief second, not because I felt ashamed, but because I felt the familiar pressure to shrink, to reduce myself to make them comfortable by becoming something easier to control. The silence around me was not empty. It was crowded with expectation, fear, embarrassment, all of it circling me while everyone waited for me to decide which version of myself I would serve them. My hand stayed still on my lap while my thoughts moved faster than my heartbeat. I understood exactly what they wanted to hear. I understood which version of my life would make them feel safe, respectable, untouched by anything they considered beneath them. I also understood in that quiet moment that I had reached the edge of something I could no longer keep doing to myself. I told myself I would not lie. I told myself I would not decorate my answers to make their faces relax. I told myself that whatever happened after this, I would not tear myself smaller, just to survive another dinner that was never meant to be safe for me in the first place. Inside my chest, the decision felt heavier than fear. I kept my face still while the room waited, because I already knew that whatever I said next would change the way this table felt forever, even if no one admitted it out loud. When I spoke, I didn't raise my voice, and that somehow made everything heavier. I felt the pressure settle inside my chest, not like fear, but like a quiet decision that no one else could take away. My voice stayed steady because I was done shrinking myself just to make the room feel comfortable, and I refused to soften the truth for people who had never softened their treatment of me. I did not attack anyone. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply spoke as someone who had carried too much for too long. I told them that the version of me they pretended not to see had always been stronger than the image they created. I explained how Brielle had used my life as material for her own stories, how she twisted ordinary moments into jokes, how she made herself look impressive by painting me as someone embarrassing. I said her words had not been harmless, because words repeated for years become part of how people learn to see someone in their own home. I let them hear that this was not accidental behavior, but a pattern that had been comfortable for her. I said that silence had not been neutral. I said that Mom and Dad did not just look away when it happened because they participated through distance, coldness, dismissal, and convenient distractions. I described the way I had been left alone during moments when protection should have been automatic, when support should have been instinctive, when kindness should have been present without being requested. I told them that neglect is not only loud, it can be quiet, slow, and constant. Then I turned toward Trevor without raising my tone or changing my posture. I told him I was not speaking out of jealousy, bitterness, or desperation. I told him he was not special because he had walked into a story that had already repeated itself. I watched his face carefully before I said the sentence that changed the air in the room. "You're the third guy this month she brought home." The room did not explode, but it collapsed inward. Dad looked away first, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the tension of someone trying to keep control while feeling it slip. His jaw tightened so hard the muscle jumped, and he could not find a single word to defend what had been allowed for years. Mom's fingers began to tremble against the edge of the table, and her lips pressed together so tightly that the color drained from them. She tried to sit straighter, tried to look composed, but the panic crept through her shoulders, visible in the way her breathing shifted. Brielle's face changed so fast that she forgot to hide it. The color dropped from her skin, her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if every sentence she had planned disappeared at once. Her eyes moved from Trevor to Mom to Dad, searching for a rescue that did not come. I did not feel powerful. I did not feel dramatic. I felt clear. For the first time in that house, I felt like I was not asking permission to exist. I said nothing else after that because nothing else was needed. About 15 minutes later, nothing in that house felt controlled anymore. Time inside that room lost its shape, stretching into something slow and uncomfortable that pressed against my chest without giving me space to breathe. I stayed seated, not speaking, not moving, watching the air grow heavier as every fork rested untouched and every glass remained full. Trevor shifted first his chair, scraping softly against the floor as his body leaned closer to Brielle with a tension that no longer looked polite. He did not raise his voice when he spoke to her, yet the firmness in his tone carried enough weight to change the rhythm of the room. He asked her to stand up with him, not as a request, not as a question, but as a clear signal that this moment no longer belonged to the family table. His hand touched her wrist in a way that was not gentle, but not cruel, either, just intentional. Brielle hesitated for a brief moment that felt much longer than it was, then stood up slowly, trying to shape her face back into the soft smile she had practiced for years. It did not work this time. Trevor moved toward the hallway without looking back, and she followed him with steps that felt less confident than she wanted them to appear. No one in the dining room spoke. Mom stayed frozen in her chair, her shoulders tight, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, as if it suddenly required all of her attention. Dad kept staring at the wall across from him, his hands folded together, his jaw locked in a quiet tension that betrayed far more than words could have. I could hear their voices from the other side of the hallway, not clearly enough to repeat every word, but clearly enough to feel the pressure of them. Trevor spoke low and fast, his sentences clipped in frustration. Brielle tried to defend herself with the same rhythm she had relied on before, but the steadiness in her voice had disappeared. Her words started to slip over one another, no longer clean, no longer polished, no longer controlled. I heard the sound of her breath changing, the slight crack that had never been there before. I heard Trevor stop responding for a few long seconds, allowing silence to do what anger could not. When they came back into view, everything about their posture had changed. Trevor did not look at the table. He did not look at Mom. He did not look at Dad. His face held a quiet expression, not rage, not sadness, but something colder, something more final. Brielle stopped a few steps behind him, as if she already understood that following closer would not change what was coming. He walked toward the front door without hesitation, his footsteps even, his shoulders straight, his focus steady. He opened the door, stepped outside, and closed it behind him without a single backward glance. No goodbye, no explanation, no apology offered to anyone. The sound of the door settling into its frame felt louder than any argument that could have filled that space. Brielle remained standing in the middle of the room, her hands loose at her sides, her breath shallow, her eyes shifting in small, unfocused movements, as if she were trying to understand where control had slipped away from her. I stayed silent, not because I was afraid, but because nothing else needed to be said. Sometimes the quiet carries more truth than any voice ever could. Later that night, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like pressure about to explode. I stayed seated longer than anyone else, not because I felt small again, but because I wanted to understand how quickly a room could shift from control to collapse. The air felt heavier without Trevor, as if the truth he pulled loose was still circling the ceiling, refusing to disappear. Dad was the first to move, not physically, but emotionally. His shoulders tightened, his jaw locked, and when he finally spoke, his voice no longer tried to sound calm. He told me I had embarrassed this family, that I had humiliated them in front of someone who never needed to know our business, and that my timing was selfish. He did not ask why I spoke. He only asked why I did it in front of a stranger, as though silence had been a duty I was born to protect. Mom shifted after him, no longer frozen, no longer quiet. Her eyes stayed on me while her hands trembled just slightly in her lap. She said I had crossed a line, said I should have stayed quiet for one more night, said I had ruined something that could have been handled privately. Her tone was not screaming, but it was sharp enough to cut, because this was the first time she chose disappointment over distance. For years she avoided me without emotion, but now she looked at me with blame that felt heavier than neglect. The sound of footsteps interrupted the tension, slow, unsteady, and irritated. Brielle returned to the dining room with eyes that no longer tried to look composed. She did not sit down. She stood behind her chair, gripping the back of it like she needed something to hold her upright. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but it was not sadness, it was anger that had nowhere else to land. She accused me of ruining her happiness, of tearing apart a moment that was supposed to belong to her, of dragging out truths that did not matter. She moved closer with every sentence, not touching me but trying to press her presence into my space. She said I had no right to speak, that I had always been too quiet to deserve attention, and that I only opened my mouth now because I wanted to hurt her. Her words were louder than before, but they sounded empty because they were no longer balanced by control. This was what she sounded like without power. I did not argue back. I did not defend myself loudly. I kept my posture still, my hands relaxed, my breathing steady. The calm I felt did not come from weakness. It came from distance I had already created inside myself. I looked at all of them without raising my voice and said that I was no longer interested in being managed, hidden, reshaped, or explained to protect their image. I told them that I was allowed to speak when something hurt me. I was allowed to tell the truth when I felt erased. I was allowed to stand in a room without being corrected into silence. I made it clear that I was not asking for permission anymore, and I was not apologizing for refusing to lie. The room went quiet again, but this time it was different. It was not controlled silence. It was not comfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when people realize they have lost authority over someone they thought would never move. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I knew this would be the last night I let my family decide how much pain I was supposed to tolerate to keep the peace. I did not threaten them. I did not announce anything dramatic. I simply understood that the door between us had closed, not with anger, but with clarity. I stayed seated not because I belonged there, but because I was no longer afraid of standing up. A few weeks later, silence in my life stopped feeling empty. It started feeling honest. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came with warmth. Stopped preparing explanations I no longer owed to anyone. Stopped shrinking my thoughts just to keep a room comfortable for people who never tried to understand me. My days became quieter in a way that felt clean instead of lonely. I woke up without feeling watched, judged, or measured against someone else's version of success. That was when my close friend Hannah Blake returned into my routine in a way that felt natural rather than dramatic. She never asked me to explain everything from the past or justify my choices. Hannah never spoke to me with pity or curiosity that felt invasive. She simply treated my decisions as something normal and something worthy of respect. We spent time talking about plans instead of pain, about what felt safe instead of what had hurt, about boundaries instead of apologies. One afternoon, while sitting across from her with warm cups in our hands, I realized something that surprised me. The conversation never circled around bitterness or anger. It stayed grounded in acceptance and self-protection. I did not feel the need to defend myself, lower my voice, or soften my truth. That calm did more for me than any argument I could have ever won inside that old house. While my life moved forward, the consequences behind me unfolded quietly. Brielle began to lose the easy admiration she once relied on. People started stepping back from her without confrontation, not because of loud accusations, but because patterns became harder to ignore. Her stories stopped sounding charming, and her behavior stopped being excused. Situations that once worked in her favor started revealing cracks. She could no longer hide behind polished smiles. My parents felt their own shift in ways they could not control. Friends who once praised their perfect image grew distant. Conversations, shortened invitations became less frequent. Nothing dramatic happened, no public scene, no loud exposure. The distance grew naturally, slowly, without cruelty, the way truth often does when it is no longer forced to stay buried. Through all of that, I did not feel the urge to return or explain myself. I felt space where guilt once lived. I felt clarity where confusion had stayed too long. For the first time, I understood that distance was not something I owed an explanation for. Distance was something I earned by finally choosing peace over permission. I learned that self-respect does not arrive loudly. It settles quietly when you finally stop asking for approval from people who only valued you in pieces. Cutting ties is not an act of weakness. It is an act of survival that teaches your mind and heart to breathe again. Silence is not the same as surrender. It can be the strongest boundary you ever place between yourself and harm. If you stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you for giving your time and your attention to something that was deeply personal. I hope you felt seen rather than entertained, understood rather than judged. If any part of this reflected your own experience, you are welcome to share your thoughts in the comments, not for validation, but for connection. There are moments when a single sentence lands so sharply that your mind needs a moment to catch up. Mine arrived on a warm afternoon in Nashville when everything I thought I could tolerate shifted at once. My name is Mallory, and until that day, I truly believed I already knew the limits of how far my family could push me. "Sorry, your iPhone 17 is broken," my older sister said, after I refused to lend her $10,000. Her voice was flat, almost bored, and the shattered screen in her hand made it obvious she had not dropped it by mistake. I asked why she had even touched my phone without asking. She gave a small shrug, as if this was something I should not take personally, as if the damage she caused was a minor hiccup I should clean up quietly. Before I could process anything fully, Mom stepped in with that familiar softness she used only in one direction and told me it was just an accident. She added that I should not make a big deal out of it. She did not ask what happened or look closely enough to see the way my jaw tightened. It was the same script as always. My sister created the mess, Mom swept it aside, and I was expected to swallow the frustration as some sort of proof that I cared about family. I stayed silent because silence has a way of revealing what people expect from you. My sister watched me the way someone watches a machine they believe will perform exactly the way it always has. She truly thought I would absorb the hit and move on. Instead, I felt something settle inside me with a clarity I had not felt before. I knew I had reached a point I could not return from. If you were in my place with the phone in pieces and the excuses already waiting to be used, what would you have done next? Tell me your thoughts and how you would handle a moment like this. That afternoon, when I returned to my apartment in Nashville, the quiet felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were watching me sort through everything that had happened. I set my bag down and tried to focus on my breathing, yet my mind kept circling back to the same truth I had avoided naming for years. My older sister, Kendra Collins, had not suddenly turned into someone capable of smashing my phone for $10,000. She had always walked the line between entitlement and convenience, and I had spent most of my life stepping aside to make space for her choices. I sank onto my couch and replayed moments I had forced myself to minimize, the ones that piled up quietly enough to pass for normal at the time. There were the afternoons when she borrowed money, promising to return it before the month ended, only for me to cover her shortfalls when she forgot a payment. There were the mornings when I discovered she had used my name to apply for a store card because hers had too many late fees. Each incident seemed small on its own, yet the cost always fell on my shoulders, while Mom insisted I should be patient because families look out for one another. That version of looking out had always tilted toward Kendra, no matter how inconvenient it was for me. As the tension pressed deeper, my best friend Jordan Hale called, after noticing the way my voice cracked when we spoke earlier. Jordan had known me long enough to catch the shift I tried to hide, and when I explained what happened, the frustration that colored Jordan's silence told me everything. I rarely vented yet. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt the years of imbalance settle into place with a clarity that startled me. Jordan reminded me that my reactions were not dramatic, but overdue, and hearing someone validate that truth gave me just enough steadiness to keep unpacking the memories I had stored away. It was impossible to ignore how early the dynamic had begun. When I was still in school, Mom always found a reason to soften consequences for Kendra, claiming she was sensitive or overwhelmed, while I was expected to adjust because I could supposedly handle more. The message was subtle, but consistent, and with time I learned how to absorb disappointment without letting it show. I thought restraint made me the responsible one, the daughter who kept the peace, yet all it did was teach everyone that I would bend until there was nothing left to bend. Sitting there, I realized I had reached a place where even small acts of dismissal carried weight I could no longer absorb. The shattered phone was only the most visible part of a pattern that had stretched across my entire life, and once I named it, I could no longer pretend it was something harmless. A tiredness I had not allowed myself to acknowledge settled through me, heavier than I wanted to admit, yet unmistakably honest. I knew I could not return to the version of myself who tolerated everything out of duty. Something had shifted in me, steady and irreversible, and for the first time in years I understood that pulling back was not disloyalty, but survival. That night, when I checked my accounts again, a sense of unease settled over me with a clarity I could no longer ignore. I opened my laptop with the intention of reviewing only a few recent transactions, yet the moment the dashboard loaded, I realized the situation stretched far deeper than a single broken phone. What began as a simple search for unusual charges quickly unfolded into a trail of activity that looked nothing like my own behavior, and the more I scrolled, the more the pieces began aligning in ways that tightened my chest. The first red flag appeared on my Apple Family sharing page. I had set it up years ago for convenience, mostly so my devices stayed synced and my subscriptions stayed organized. However, when I opened the purchase history, several apps I had never downloaded appeared in the list, bundled into months of quiet charges that slipped past my attention. They were lifestyle subscriptions, editing tools, and premium upgrades that matched someone else's habits rather than mine. The pattern felt unmistakable, especially when I recognized the timestamps lining up with moments when Kendra had borrowed my phone under the pretense of checking her messages. At the time, the requests had felt harmless, yet the evidence displayed something far more deliberate. As I dug deeper, I noticed several microtransactions routed through Apple Pay. Some were small grocery charges, others were miscellaneous household items from stores Mom frequented. The amounts were minor on their own, low enough to blend into any monthly budget without raising alarms, yet the consistency of the pattern made the intention difficult to dismiss. I remembered the times Mom mentioned forgetting her card or needing to pay quickly, moments I had brushed off as routine family favors. Seeing the trail logged in my own records stripped away the excuses I had held on to. Trying to keep my focus steady, I called Jordan and asked for help, verifying whether certain charges showed signs of being manually approved or automatically recurring. Jordan approached the situation from a technical angle rather than an emotional one, examining the timestamps, the device IDs, and the authorization logs. Without the softness of sympathy, Jordan pointed out that several purchases had been authorized through devices that were not registered to me, which meant someone had been using my credentials without my knowledge. The precision of that conclusion pushed everything into a sharper shape, leaving me with an unsettling recognition of how long this boundary had been crossed. I opened a blank document and began compiling each suspicious entry, organizing them by category, so my thoughts would not scatter. The list grew steadily, turning from scattered lines into a structured record of how my accounts had been treated as communal property. I highlighted the apps tied to Kendra's habits and marked the purchases aligning with Mom's routines, then grouped the remaining anomalies under a column I labeled Uncertain Source. As the file expanded, it became clear that the financial damage reached farther than the visible totals. What troubled me most was the realization that this misuse was not new, yet I had been too willing to rationalize the signs until now. Once the evidence sat plainly in front of me, I felt a quiet shift inside a shift that made denial impossible. I opened my settings and began the first round of what I silently called my quiet moves. Subtle actions meant to protect myself without announcing anything. I updated my passwords with combinations no one could guess, removed all shared devices, and revoked permissions tied to old logins. Each step felt like reclaiming a part of my life I had handed over too easily. By the time I finished, the document glowed on my screen, filled with proof of choices I had allowed others to make for me. The exhaustion that followed did not overwhelm me this time. It steadied me, reminding me that recognition was the first step toward taking back control, and the trail of evidence I gathered made one thing certain: the pattern had finally reached its end. Near midnight, I began moving with a clarity that felt unfamiliar, yet steady, as if every scattered thought had finally aligned after the discoveries I made earlier that evening. The apartment around me rested in a muted calm that helped me focus on what needed to be done. I opened the Apple ID control panel and took a slow breath before undoing the family sharing network entirely. Each device that was not mine appeared like a reminder of the boundaries I had allowed to stretch far beyond reason. As I removed every layer of access, I could feel a quiet separation taking shape, not through dramatic declarations, but through the small, deliberate clicks of someone reclaiming what belonged to her. I continued by updating every password linked to my digital life. I changed the main Apple ID first, then moved through secondary email logins, banking access points, encrypted notes, and archived storage. I created long sequences of characters with no personal meaning, so nothing could be guessed or retraced. Each confirmation screen felt like a door closing behind me, and the sense of control that returned with every step settled into my chest with a calm resolve. I checked for any remaining logged-in devices, revoked them without hesitation, and watched the list shrink until only my own devices remained. The moment the page refreshed, a new kind of stillness settled into the room. Next, I called the carrier. I verified my identity, confirmed the account number, and requested the immediate termination of Kendra's secondary line. The representative asked if I understood that this action would fully disconnect the service she had been using. My answer was steady, firm, and final. When the representative confirmed that the line had been removed from my account, I noted the call ID and the exact timestamp in my growing document. Having a clear piece of evidence for each action gave me a sense of grounding, as if I were stepping onto solid ground after standing on something unstable for far too long. Once the confirmation arrived, I drafted a notification to the accounts Kendra had accessed through my Apple ID. I did not include blame or emotional explanations. I simply stated that all permissions were revoked, that linked services would no longer function, and that I would not be responsible for any charges that appeared from that moment forward. I sent the message without expecting a reply because I understood that my goal was not to engage in another draining conversation, but to close the pathways that should never have existed. After that, I contacted Kendra's landlord, the same person who once required me to co-sign her lease when she was facing financial issues. I reintroduced myself and asked about the current status of her contract. The landlord mentioned a few outstanding charges, so I requested copies of the relevant documents. I explained that I intended to withdraw my guarantee within the time frame allowed by the agreement and asked for written confirmation once the process was complete. The conversation remained brief because the landlord recognized that my request fell entirely within my rights. When the documents arrived in my inbox, I saved every file to a dedicated folder and backed them up again in my private cloud storage. I returned to my master document and added each completed step. With every new line, the situation that once felt tangled and overwhelming became structured enough for me to see exactly where I stood. I closed my laptop just as the clock marked the start of a new day, and the quiet surrounding me settled with a different weight than before. As I looked at the faint reflection of my face on the dark screen, I understood that the silent choices I made tonight were not only meant to sever old patterns, but also to ensure that I would never slip back into a life where my boundaries could be treated as optional. The next morning when I arrived at the office, I already sensed that the day would demand a level of steadiness I had only recently learned to trust in myself. I set my bag on my desk, reviewed my calendar for a brief moment, and then heard the hurried steps of the front desk assistant heading straight toward me. She informed me in a low voice that 2 visitors were waiting in the lobby demanding to speak with me. Even before I reached the hallway, I knew exactly who they were. Kendra stood in the center of the reception area with a posture meant to claim attention she believed she deserved. Her expression carried a mix of fury and entitlement that she was not trying to hide. Mom stood slightly behind her, attempting to mask discomfort with a soft tone that did not match the impatience visible in her eyes. The moment Kendra spotted me, she pushed forward with no intention of restraint. "You locked me out of everything. Fix it right now," she said loudly enough for several employees to turn their heads. Mom followed with a gentle plea. "Mallory, please stop being unreasonable. Your sister is stressed. Restore her access." Her voice tried to sound composed, yet it still carried an expectation that I would eventually give in the same way I used to. I kept my stance firm. I reminded them that every account in question belonged solely to me, and that I had acted within my full rights. Kendra refused to accept what she called an excuse. She leaned closer with a glare that revealed the pressure she felt. "If you refuse, I will make sure everyone here knows exactly how selfish you are. Do you think they will respect you after that?" Jordan entered the area at that moment in a professional capacity, as part of our company's internal compliance team. Jordan did not approach me for emotional support. Instead, Jordan positioned himself nearby to ensure that no one violated conduct policies. There was no comforting, no softening of the situation, and no involvement in the dispute unfolding between me and my family. Kendra escalated quickly when she saw that I remained calm. "You owe me access. I built everything through your accounts. You cannot shut me out because you are upset." I kept eye contact and replied with deliberate clarity that unauthorized use of another person's Apple ID in financial services was unacceptable. I stated that the removal of her access was a necessary corrective action and not an impulsive reaction to hurt feelings. Mom attempted once more to use the familiar appeal to familial obligation, but the weight of that argument no longer reached me. The commotion drew the attention of office management, who arrived with a firm request. They informed Kendra that she was disrupting a secure workspace and had to leave immediately. She pushed back with a confrontational tone, insisting she had every right to stay. When security approached, she finally stepped toward the exit. Before crossing the doorway, she turned sharply and delivered a final threat. "You will regret this when you need us." I answered with a steady voice that surprised even me. I told her that every decision I made reflected what had already happened, and that I was prepared to accept whatever followed. Once they left the building, I paused briefly to gather my breath, fully aware that this confrontation marked only the beginning of the shift I had committed myself to see through. 3 days later, I sensed the first real shift in the atmosphere around me, a shift that showed how far the ripple effects of my quiet decisions had begun to reach. I woke with a strange steadiness that morning, a clarity that felt earned rather than borrowed, and I prepared myself for whatever would unfold across the next hours. What I did not expect was how quickly the walls around Kendra would start closing in once the systems propping her up finally stopped carrying her weight. The first sign arrived through a brief message from a colleague who wondered whether I had heard about the email outage in Kendra's department. I kept my response neutral since her employer's internal problems had nothing to do with me. My focus remained on my own work until mid-morning when an unfamiliar number called my office line. The voice on the other end introduced himself as a supervisor from Kendra's workplace and asked whether I had any insight into why she could not access her corporate account. His tone suggested he believed I might hold a missing piece of information. I clarified that I had no involvement in the administration of their digital platforms and that any authentication issues would need to be addressed directly with their internal team. He thanked me politely, although I sensed he realized there was far more happening than he had initially assumed. By early afternoon, another consequence emerged. My landlord forwarded a notice from the property manager of Kendra's apartment complex. They requested confirmation regarding the financial guarantee I had provided when she first moved in. I opened the document carefully and drafted a formal statement retracting my support. I included every required detail with careful precision, then submitted it through the official portal so there would be a complete record of the change. Once I received the confirmation, I saved the file in the same folder that held the rest of the documentation I had been compiling. Later that day, my phone lit up again, this time with a message from a cousin who asked why Mom was calling relatives to express her concern about what she described as my completely unreasonable behavior. According to her, I had left Kendra helpless during a challenging moment and brought embarrassment to the family. I allowed the message to sit on my screen for several minutes before answering because I needed to consider what outcome I wanted from the conversation. I finally wrote that personal boundaries were not acts of hostility and that none of the current complications had been created by me. I did not offer further explanation because I had reached a point in my life where unnecessary justification felt like a surrender of control. While the relatives debated and speculated, Kendra faced a stronger wave of problems. She attempted to present alternative documents to her employer, but everything required access to the email address she could no longer open. Human Resources temporarily suspended her while they investigated what they called irregular credential activity. I heard about this only because Jordan forwarded a short update from someone who had witnessed the meeting. Jordan did not comment on the situation and did not express sympathy on my behalf. He merely passed the information in the same direct manner he used whenever we discussed factual details related to my case. That evening, I sat at my desk and reviewed the timeline of events from the past several days. Each action I had taken had been quiet, deliberate, and fully within my rights. The consequences unfolding now were not punishments I had imposed, but outcomes Kendra had created for herself. Watching those patterns finally surface brought an unexpected sense of closure. I understood that this was only the beginning, yet I also recognized that my boundaries were finally holding. For the first time in years, I felt no need to rescue anyone from the fallout of their own choices. A week later, I realized that the silence surrounding Kendra had taken on a heavier quality, as if the consequences that had been building around her finally decided to arrive all at once. I noticed the shift first through a brief message forwarded by a colleague who had attended a meeting with her company's HR department. He wrote that her suspension was no longer temporary because she failed to complete mandatory verification steps that required access to systems she could not enter. I read the message twice without reacting. I felt a distant sense of recognition, as though I had expected this moment to unfold in its exact shape. Later that morning, another notification appeared on my phone. It came from the company's employment portal, the one where I had once signed an income verification document to support her application during a period when she insisted she needed help, just until she settled in. The alert showed that her employer had filed a termination notice that would soon be reflected on future screenings. It was clinical in tone, stripped of emotion, which made it even more striking. I sat with it quietly, aware that this was one of the final threads she had relied on as proof of independence. By midweek, the second consequence emerged. The property manager of her apartment complex emailed me with a follow-up message requesting an updated guarantor form. They wrote that without renewed confirmation, the lease would automatically enter a 30-day reconsideration period. I opened their message, reviewed the details they attached, and submitted documents confirming my withdrawal. Within a few hours, they acknowledged it and added a formal notice explaining that Kendra would need to meet income requirements on her own. I saved the correspondence in the same folder where I kept the other records because organization brought me a certain steadiness during these days. That evening, a relative from out of town sent me a concerned message. She said that Mom had been calling various branches of the family, explaining that I had abandoned Kendra during a moment of crisis, and that everything happening to her was the result of my refusal to act like a sister. I read the message slowly. I could almost hear Mom's familiar mix of guilt and contradiction. If her statements had been consistent, perhaps they would have carried weight, but she shifted her narrative depending on audience and outcome, and this pattern had repeated throughout my life. I wrote back that each adult must take responsibility for the structures they depend on. I kept my answer brief because further explanation rarely changed anything. 2 days later, I received confirmation that Kendra had been given a deadline to vacate the apartment. Word traveled quickly through relatives that she packed in a rush and moved into a spare room belonging to a distant cousin who lived nearly an hour from the city center. Apparently, she tried to present alternative proof of finances but could not meet the thresholds. They said she appeared shocked by how fast everything unraveled, as if she still believed someone would intervene on her behalf. When I finished reading those updates, I placed my phone face down and returned to the task in front of me. I had signed paperwork for my own move earlier that morning. The new apartment was tucked far from downtown Nashville in a quieter neighborhood that felt like a different rhythm entirely. The drive was longer, yet something about the distance felt right. I wanted a space where no one barged through boundaries or used my stability as a safety net. On the following afternoon, a letter from Mom appeared in my mailbox. Her handwriting was uneven. She alternated between blaming me, defending Kendra, and contradicting her own arguments in consecutive lines. I read it once without letting any of it settle, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. I did not owe her a response, and I no longer felt the urge to carry responsibility that did not belong to me. As my moving boxes stacked higher, I sensed the shape of my life shifting into something steadier. The chaos circling the family no longer reached me. They operated in their turbulence, and I stood outside of it for the first time. It felt less like a victory, and more like a return to myself, a quiet acknowledgement that peace sometimes begins the moment you stop allowing others to define your role in their storms. 1 month later, the rhythm of my life settled into a steadier pattern that felt earned rather than borrowed. My workdays became more focused because I no longer spent energy anticipating the next crisis that might erupt around Kendra. My productivity increased in ways that surprised even my supervisor, and the additional responsibilities I accepted came with a pay raise that quietly affirmed my decision to protect my boundaries. I moved through the weeks with a clarity that had been missing for years, and each completed project reinforced the feeling that I had reclaimed control of my direction. News about Kendra arrived in fragments, usually through relatives who struggled to understand how she had fallen so quickly from the comfortable position she once held. They said she bounced between temporary jobs that paid inconsistently, and none of them provided the stability she needed to regain footing. Without a guarantor and without reliable income records, she found herself unable to sign new leases. She remained in that distant cousin's home where patience was wearing thin. Her expenses grew heavier while her earnings shrank, and those who once stepped forward to rescue her now avoided involvement altogether. I listened when these updates reached me, though I did not seek them out. During that same period, Mom attempted to call several times, leaving messages that alternated between emotional appeals and attempts to frame the situation as a misunderstanding. I allowed the calls to pass without response, because each message revealed the same contradiction. She wanted me to undo the consequences that Kendra created while refusing to acknowledge the history that led to this distance. My silence was not punishment, it was self-preservation. In the middle of all this, Jordan stopped by one afternoon after finishing a security rotation near my neighborhood. We sat on my balcony with iced tea while discussing neutral topics like traffic patterns and office renovations. He did not bring up the family situation, and I did not offer details. The conversation felt light and respectful, free of the unspoken pressure that had existed when he witnessed the confrontation at work. When he left, I appreciated that the visit was simply a gesture of familiarity rather than a rescue attempt. As the month closed, I recognized that my life felt simpler because I had finally stepped outside the roles others assigned to me. I no longer served as a buffer for their decisions or a catch-all solution for their emergencies. Peace became possible when responsibility returned to its rightful owners. I learned that boundaries are not declarations of anger, but commitments to self-respect. When people grow accustomed to leaning on you without accountability, they mistake your silence for agreement and your support for obligation. Stepping back revealed which relationships relied on genuine care and which depended on convenience. The moment I stopped absorbing the weight of other people's choices, I finally understood that protecting my well-being does not require permission from those who once benefited from my compliance. Thank you for following this story through each turning point and for giving space to a perspective shaped by difficult choices. If you have ever stepped away from a situation that demanded more than it returned, I would love to hear how you navigated that change. Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments so others who face similar crossroads can feel less alone